Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental to how we build these, AI systems that write code.
Yeah.
Like, we all know that AI is getting really good at spitting out code that runs, no syntax errors.
Right.
But there's this paper, and it kind of asks this interesting question, like, do we even need to bother with explicitly teaching these models like grammar rules?
Mm-hmm.
Since they seem to just figure it out anyway.
Yeah.
And, the answer is a little more complicated than you might think. Turns out explicitly teaching them grammar, it actually seems to make the code better.
Yeah, it's really interesting. For years, especially with these smaller models, encoding grammar directly, it was seen as critical, as this guiding hand to make sure that the generated code actually followed the rules, like a set of blueprints for building a house, right? You got to have the structure in place.
Yes, like those early approaches, they treated each grammar rule as if it was a fundamental Lego brick.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of had to have the right bricks to build anything meaningful.
Exactly.
And we saw a lot of research showing how powerful that was, right? Like getting rid of all the syntax errors and just making the smaller models work better overall. Each grammar rule was another piece of the puzzle. But then we got these huge models, the LLMs, right, with billions of parameters.
Yeah.
Companies like OpenAI, DeepSeek AI, and Quinn, all kind of churning these out. And after they've gobbled up mountains of code, it seems like they get syntax intuitively.
They seem to grasp the structure.
They just figure it out. So this paper, it really gets at the heart of that.
Yeah.
Like, all right, if these token-based models, if they're so good at syntax already, why would we even bother with this grammar-based representation?
Yeah.
And that's where the researchers came in, right? They built these grammar coder models. Mm-hmm. And they're designed to kind of bake in those grammar rules right into the process, even at this massive scale. Right. So it's a really interesting test.
Yeah, and the results are really interesting too.
Oh, yeah.
They took their grammar coder models, 1.3 billion parameters, 1.5 billion parameters, and they compared them to other token-based models of about the same size. Mm-hmm. But these token-based models were trained on exactly the same data, but without that explicit grammar. And what they found was that grammar coder was consistently better. For example, on the MVPP benchmark, their 1.3 billion parameter grammar coder was about 7% better than a similar DeepSeek coder model. But that one was trained without the grammar.
Wow.
That's a big difference.
That's a huge leap. Yeah.
It is. And it makes you wonder, why?
Why is it better?
If these token-based models are spitting out code that looks fine, where's this extra intelligence coming from?
Right.
Well, the paper suggests that the key difference, it isn't about syntax. It's about semantics.
Okay.
It's about understanding the meaning of the code, not just the structure.
Okay. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Sure.
This idea of semantic understanding. Am I right in saying that the paper is basically arguing that grammar-based representations, they kind of highlight those subtle differences between snippets of code that might look almost identical on the surface, just a couple of words different.
Right.
But those tiny changes, they actually mean something totally different.
They can, yeah.
And their experiments, it seems like they actually back that up.
Yeah, they do a really good job of setting the stage in their introduction. They talk about how grammar is just this fundamental aspect of how programming languages work. It's the foundation of structure and how we understand code. They talk about the benefits we've seen with grammar in these smaller models historically. Uh-huh. And then they highlight this current situation where the big LLMs rarely make syntax errors.
Yeah.
And it's that contrast that leads to their main question about whether grammar is still relevant. So then they build these grammar coder models.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about how grammar coder actually works, like what's under the hood.
Well, at its core, it's a decoder-only architecture, similar to those foundational models that Vaswani and Radford developed. They took these existing open source code models, specifically DeepSeek Coder 1.3b base and Quinn 2.5 1.5b base, and then they continued to pre-train them and instruction tune them.
Okay.
But the key difference, and this is the big one, is how they incorporate those grammar rules into the representation and the generation of the code itself.
So it's not just predicting the next, token, the next word in the sequence, but also what grammar rule should apply next.
That's exactly it.
Interesting.
So with traditional models, you're basically just stringing tokens together one after another. But with Grammar Coder, the goal is to generate a complete abstract syntax tree.
An AST.
Yeah, an AST, by selecting and applying these grammar rules. You can think of an AST as like a blueprint of the code structure. It shows how all the different pieces fit together. So instead of just throwing words together, Grammar Coder builds this blueprint first, which forces it to really understand how the code is organized. And once you have that blueprint, you can then generate the executable code from it.
It's like a more structured approach.
It is.
Instead of just kind of free-flowing.
Yeah, and their vocabulary reflects that too.
Oh, interesting.
So they have the standard BPE tokens for individual words and symbols. That's V-normal. But they also have this separate vocabulary specifically for grammar rules.
Okay.
That's rule. And the idea is that these sequences of grammar rules, they capture those logical dependencies in the hierarchical structure of the code. If you look at figure 1 in the paper, it gives a really helpful visual. It shows a simple program, it's AST, and how that translates into this grammar-based representation. And you can see how the grammar rules are guiding the construction of that tree-like structure, while the normal tokens are filling in the specific details, like names of variables and stuff.
So it's like they have these two vocabularies working together.
Right.
Normal and rule.
Yeah.
And then they combine those into this V grammar.
Exactly.
And then during training, the model's job is to predict what comes next in that sequence.
Yep.
And it could be a normal token or it could be a grammar rule. It's really interesting.
It's really cool. They trained these Grammar Coder models on a massive amount of code. I mean, comparable to what the baselines were trained on, but they added those grammar rules.
Yeah.
And this training happened in 2 stages. First, they did what they called base model training. This was on 10 billion tokens of Python code from the stack V2. And then they added another 500 million tokens from code textbooks.
From textbooks?
Yeah, from textbooks.
Interesting.
That's actually really interesting because it's like giving the model these really clean, well-structured examples of code, which could help it learn those fundamental principles better.
Yeah, it's like learning from both real-world code and kind of like the ideal textbook examples.
Exactly. And then in the second stage, they did instruction tuning. Okay.
This was using 6 billion tokens of instruction data from public datasets. And they also used some data synthesis techniques to really refine the model's ability to understand instructions given in natural language. Okay, so we've got Grammar Coder trained up. It's got this grammar-aware approach. How do they actually test it?
Well, they had 2 main sets of experiments. The first was to compare its performance on standard benchmarks for code generation.
Okay.
So that's human evil and MVPP. And they tested both with and without the more rigorous eval plus test cases.
Got it.
And they compared Grammar Coder against their baseline models, DeepSeek Coder Fash 1.3b and Qwen 2.5 1.5b, and they continued to pre-train those baselines as well.
Okay.
But without the grammar-based representation.
Right. Apples to apples.
Exactly. They really wanted to make sure it was a fair comparison. They used the same training data and everything.
Yeah, so really isolate the effect of the grammar.
Exactly.
Okay, and the key metric here was pass at 1.
Yeah, basically whether the very first piece of code the model generated was correct and passed all the tests.
Okay, so no partial credit here.
Nope.
It's got to be perfect.
It has to be perfect.
All right, so what happened?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, Grammar Coder beat the token-based models by a good margin.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, the token-based models, they were already getting almost perfect syntax.
So they weren't making those obvious errors.
Not really, no.
But Grammar Coder was still better at solving the actual problems.
Yeah, and you can see that in table 2 of the paper. Grammar Coder is even competitive with some state-of-the-art models that have way more parameters. They do point out, though, that the size and quality of the training data matters a lot. Some of those top-performing models, they were trained on much larger data sets.
Right. So there's always room for improvement.
There always is,
Yeah.
but this was still a really significant result.
Okay, so that was the first set of experiments. What about the second?
Well, the second set, they really wanted to understand why Grammar Coder was performing so well. Their hypothesis was that the grammar-based representation, it specifically helps with those semantic errors, Those mistakes in the logic or the meaning of the code, the ones that can slip through even when the syntax is perfect.
Like those kind of tricky bugs that are hard to catch.
Exactly. And they thought that using grammar in the representation, it kind of amplifies the differences between the correct and incorrect code at a more fundamental level.
Interesting.
So they did some really interesting analysis to test that.
Okay.
So for the first part, they used this data set called Code Nanofix.
Code Nanofix?
Yeah, Code Nanofix. And it's really cool. It has over 1,000 programming problems with something like 100,000 pairs of code submissions.
Wow.
So you've got an incorrect version written by a human and then their corrected version. And the key here is that these pairs, they often have very small differences at the token level, like maybe just a few words or symbols different. But those tiny changes, they lead to big changes in how the code actually behaves. They specifically focused on pairs where the token level changes were very small.
So really subtle errors.
Yeah, really subtle. And they compared how the grammar-based and token-based representations captured those differences.
Okay, so what did they find?
Well, the results were pretty dramatic. The grammar-based representation consistently showed much larger differences between the incorrect and the correct code compared to the token-based representations.
So even though the code snippets looked almost identical, the grammar-based representations were picking up on those subtle semantic differences.
Exactly.
And that was reflected in the edit distance.
Yeah. On average, the edit distance, which is a measure of how different the representations are, it increased by over 90%. Figure 2 in the paper has a really clear example.
Okay.
It's about the order of operations in a math expression.
Right.
So just a small change in parentheses, which is a small token level edit, leads to a huge change in the abstract syntax tree. And that means a big change in the grammar-based representation as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like a small syntactic change, if it changes the meaning of the code, it's going to have a big impact on the grammar rules and that structural blueprint. Okay, so that was the first part of their analysis. What about the second part?
Okay, so for the second part, they trained what are called semantic classifiers.
Okay.
These are models that are designed to tell the difference between correct and incorrect code. And they train separate classifiers using the grammar coder representation and then standard token-based representations from models like DeepSeek Coder, Qwen, and Condor. Condor is another model that is specifically good at this kind of semantic classification task.
Okay, so they're basically testing whether the grammar-based representation gives the model an advantage in understanding the meaning of the code.
Right. They trained all these classifiers on that same Code Nanofix data set.
To see which one was best at identifying the correct code.
Exactly.
So how did they do?
Well, again, Grammar Coder's representation seemed to help. The classifiers trained on Grammar Coder, they were significantly better at figuring out which code was correct.
Interesting.
You can see all the results in Table 3 of the paper. They even compared Grammar Coder to Condor.
Right, and Condor was already pretty good at this.
Yeah, it was. And actually, one version of Grammar Coder and Condor, they actually share the same underlying model architecture.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really direct comparison. But even then, the grammar-based model performed better.
So that suggests pretty strongly that the grammar-based representation is making a real difference in how well the model understands those subtle differences in meaning.
I think so.
And they didn't just stop there.
Yeah.
They also wanted to see if there was a correlation between this difference in representation and how well Grammar Coder actually performs.
Yeah, they did a statistical test and it showed that there is a correlation.
Okay.
Basically, the bigger the difference in the grammar-based representation between those semantically different pieces of code, the better Grammar Coder was at actually generating the correct code. And they have some really cool examples in figures 4 and 5 of the paper.
Yep.
They show cases where those token-based models made mistakes that could have been fixed with just tiny token changes. But the more significant changes in the grammar-based representation, they seem to make the model much more sensitive to those little details that actually matter.
So it's almost like the grammar is acting as a magnifying glass, highlighting those semantic differences that you might miss if you were just looking at the code as a sequence of words.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But before we get to our novel notion segment, I just wanted to point out that, using grammars in computer science This isn't new.
Oh, absolutely not. It's been around for ages. The idea of using formal grammars to define the syntax of programming languages, I mean, that goes back to the very beginning of computer science.
Right. Like way back to the compiler design days.
Exactly. And the idea of using grammars and machine learning models for code, that's been explored for quite a while too, especially with those smaller models.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that recently the focus has shifted towards these massive LLMs that seem to learn syntax implicitly, just from the sheer amount of code they see. So this paper, it feels like it's taking a step back and reevaluating that explicit grammar-based approach.
Yeah.
In the context of these new massive models.
It is. And it's really important because it shows that even with these incredibly large models that are already so good at syntax, explicitly including grammar rules can still make a big difference in how well they generate code.
And it's not just about fixing syntax errors.
No.
It's about giving them a deeper understanding of the code's meaning.
Exactly.
So the takeaway here is that grammar is still relevant even in the age of LLMs.
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to our novel notions segment. This is where we take the ideas from the paper and kind of brainstorm some new research direction.
This is the fun part.
So based on this paper, what are some potential avenues for future work?
Well, one really interesting idea would be to see if we could apply this grammar-based approach to other domains that involve structured data.
Okay.
Beyond just programming languages. So, think about formal languages in mathematics, or even the syntax of biological sequences like DNA or RNA.
Oh, wow.
Could we define some kind of grammar for these domains and see similar performance improvements in those large models?
So instead of just treating them as sequences of letters, we'd be explicitly modeling the underlying structure.
Exactly. And imagine the possibilities.
Yeah.
Like better predictions of protein structure, or maybe even advances in automated theorem proving.
That's really fascinating.
It is, yeah.
Of course, the challenge would be figuring out how to define those grammars for all these different kinds of data.
That's the big one, yeah.
But it's a really intriguing idea. Okay, what else?
Well, another idea is to explore what happens when you combine this grammar-based representation with techniques that actually execute or test the generated code during training.
So like a live feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. This paper showed that grammar helps with semantic understanding, right? But what if we took it a step further? What if the model not only generated code based on grammar, but it also tried to run that code internally, or at least simulate its execution, and then use that feedback to refine both the grammar rules and the token generation process. So it's not just learning what code looks like structurally, but also whether it actually works.
So it's almost like giving the model a playground to experiment in.
Exactly.
Where it can see the consequences of its code.
Yeah, and there's already some work being done on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, integrating code generation with execution and refinement.
Okay.
Combining that with this grammar-based approach, I think that could be really, really powerful.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
So you'd have a model that not only understands the rules of the language, but also gets a sense of whether its code actually does what it's supposed to do.
Okay.
And all of that happening during the training process.
It's like training a programmer that's constantly testing their code and learning from the results.
Exactly.
That's a really compelling vision for the future.
It is.
But of course, these are just ideas.
Yeah.
Speculating here.
Just food for thought.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive. So to sum it all up, even in today's world of massive LLMs, explicitly incorporating grammar rules into their training can lead to significant improvements in their code generation abilities. And it's not just about avoiding syntax errors, it's about enhancing their understanding of the code's meaning.
It's about moving beyond just getting the structure right and actually getting to the heart of what the code is supposed to do.
Exactly. If you're interested in all the details, you can find a link to the paper in the show notes. And on that note, here's a final thought to leave you with. Given these findings, how might the balance between implicitly learned knowledge and explicitly encoded structure shift in the next generation of these large AI models? Not just for code, but for all sorts of domains. Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.